Let's just start off with a little background. Just tell me, what you're up to and how things are going.
So my name's Jason Bordoff. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, where I'm on the faculty. That's the largest energy think tank in the United States. And energy is critical for the AI revolution. It's reshaping a lot of the ways we think about energy in the United States. We just had President Trump inaugurated 2 days ago. Lots to say about what he signed on day one. One of those was a national energy emergency. Happy to offer thoughts about ways in which that makes sense or maybe doesn't. What was interesting about reading the executive order was it started first and foremost with grid reliability, grid security, grid modernization, and power prices before drill, baby, drill, and oil prices. And that's the shift that we're seeing in the United States. Of course, we've had the shale revolution over the last 15 years. The Trump administration has said they're going to dramatically accelerate it, unleash American energy dominance, exports of natural gas. But for 20 years, we sort of forgot the power sector mattered. We lost muscle memory with how to add new power generation to the grid. We took relatively low-cost electricity for granted. And that's going to be, if the Trump administration has promised to bring energy prices down for people. I think if they should be worried about any part of energy prices, it's power prices before it's oil prices. And that is not just driven by what's happening in AI, but the dramatic growth in electricity, demand for electricity, driven in significant part by AI and data centers, is a major contributor to that. And we can talk about what that, so we're doing a lot of work at the Center on Global Energy Policy on AI and energy, both energy for AI, how much energy it will take. That's about permitting reform, shortening the timeframes to new nuclear, the reality that gas is going to play a role for a meaningful period of time, and how we think about that with our sustainability and climate goals. And then also AI as a tool for the energy sector to improve efficiency and demand-side management and move more electricity through existing transmission lines, accelerate the deployment of clean energy. I think people are understandably concerned about what AI may mean for energy demand and carbon emissions, but in the long run, I'm quite optimistic that this is such an extraordinarily powerful tool. It can help enormously to use energy more efficiently and to deploy clean energy faster.
You heard Ricardo probably talking about the permitting issues, right? You mentioned the emergency, the energy emergency. There's only so much, right, that the federal government can do here. I mean, a lot of the red tape is at the state level. You actually have, I think, some of the tech companies going around to all the states now trying to remove some of that red tape. How big of a challenge do you think it is to kind of, smooth the process?
It's a huge challenge. I mean, it takes 7 to 10 years to build new transmission lines, to get permitting, to get a renewable facility up and running. The NEPA review process, the regulatory hearing process at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission takes far too long and far longer than it did 2 decades ago. So it's a really big challenge. There's a lot that can be done at the federal level. I thought there was a lot to like about the compromise bill between Senators Manchin and Barrasso on permitting reform to help get transmission built more quickly. Had provisions for oil and gas too, and it was a political compromise. But as you say, there's a limit to what the federal government can do, because even with significant efforts to streamline and improve the environmental review process, NEPA, you don't want to run over that. There's a reason we have an environmental review process. It just has to work efficiently and faster. A lot of the challenges are at the state and local level, and lawsuits that inevitably take years to work their way through the courts. But I think with the intense focus on cost and inflation, concerns about energy prices, the question is, what would a Trump administration do about that? What actions will they take? And I think there will be a significant effort on streamlining permitting. Again, I hope we do it in a way that doesn't completely run over environmental protections and rules, but we have to do that faster and in a more streamlined way. We're in a competitive race for leadership in AI technology with other countries around the world, particularly China, and we just have to scale clean. And it's existential for these companies. You're going to hear from Kate and X, the company, hyperscalers like Google. The option of not meeting the energy demand for data centers is not an option. This is existential for these companies, and people will want to do it in a green and sustainable way. They will want to do it in the United States, but they will figure out a way to do it one way or another. If it's too hard to build things in the United States, There are Gulf states with a lot of money, and Saudi and the UAE and elsewhere that are rolling out the red carpet and saying, please come locate your data centers here. And we got to think about what that means in a geopolitical context too.
Yeah, I was in Riyadh at a tech conference, and I asked somebody, well, how are you going to power these data centers? And he said, well, we'll do any way we can, burn some oil, which would not be good. Are you, when you talk about like these hurdles at the state level, I mean, have you come up with any, have you thought of any sort of creative possible solutions? Like, for instance, I mean, federal land is one. I mean, there could be some deal sweeteners for states to get them on board. What kind of creativity is there out there?
Yeah, we've seen some efforts toward creativity, like what the Biden administration just did on the way out the door to use Department of Energy and Department of Defense land to have an expedited review process for data centers for artificial intelligence. Hopefully there'll be some competition between the states too, because people want the investment. It's easier to permit things in some places than others, and whether it's transmission lines or energy pipelines or something else, there's a reason you see a lot of that happening in a place like Texas. But there's a risk too, if we're not careful about how we do this, that there's backlash, right? I mean, you see data centers are really concentrated. That creates the potential, and we have a utility structure today that often rate bases investments in new grid capacity. And so there is already growing local and community opposition to these massive investments at data centers, the noise and other construction activity that's associated with it, and potential impacts on power prices. And so I just think like one of the principles we have to go at this with is the idea that the policy landscape at the state and federal level will sort of hold the existing rate base, the consumers, mostly harmless. If people see that we're scaling AI data center capacity, maybe with a lot of not green energy or in ways that raise power prices for people, there'll be a backlash when you have these trillion-dollar companies that are becoming even wealthier for a technology that most people don't even understand yet. So managing the politics of that is important.
Is it economically good for these places to have, states or local areas to have these data centers now and have maybe the power generation nearby? You're just talking about I'm just thinking about the demand is so high that people are doing crazy stuff like Elon Musk in Memphis, right? He couldn't get the power right away, so he brought gas turbines down there without a permit, I guess. So is there a way to... are people willing to pay so much for this that you could almost make it an offer that's too good to refuse?
Well, again, it is. I do think it's existential for there's a lot of uncertainty, by the way. Is it overhyped? Are we going to see? You can fill this room and bigger than this room with reports from the late 1990s about how the internet revolution was going to cause electricity demand to go through the roof, and it never happened because the technology got more efficient, the computing technology, improvements in productivity. But there's so much uncertainty now that my perception, but someone, Kate, who's coming on next, would know better, that in the face of uncertainty, it's almost like a rounding error to overbuild data center capacity, and it is like an existential risk for these companies to underbuild. So we're just going to see a huge build out. And as you're saying, it takes a lot of time to build renewable projects. It's a decade or so for SMRs maybe, but the wait list for a combined cycle gas turbine with GE Vernova is 5 years because everyone has those in order now to find any way they can to build these data centers. One thing that's interesting, because we spend a lot of time at the Center on Global Energy Policy thinking about foreign policy and geopolitics and how this plays out, is that it's hard to move electrons and molecules, so we tend, when we think about the geography of the global energy system, you're thinking about where can you produce energy that is close to where people are, because that's what people need. Data centers, with some constraints on data privacy and rule of law and other things, can be located in a lot of places. And it is interesting to sort of think about how that opens the map. There's a lot of very low-cost clean energy around the world, hydropower and other things. It's just not necessarily useful if what you're trying to do is power homes or heat homes or power vehicles. But the possibility that data centers could be located in a different geographical set of places around the world raises a bunch of interesting questions about data privacy and AI sovereignty and geopolitical competition between countries.
I remember back I think it was right after 9/11, Tom Friedman was writing these columns about how there's this great opportunity right now. We could put a bunch of federal money into research and building new green energy, and we become a global leader in that and be economically great, right? And I think we can all agree that that probably would have been a good idea, as you kind of.
But this can be a big driver of that. I mean, I have worked in the Obama administration and the Clinton administration. Not surprisingly, there are things about the climate agenda of the incoming administration that concern me. But the focus on we need to increase firm power, 24/7 generation capacity in the United States. Gas is going to be a part of that. Yes, it's happening, but this could be one of the most pro-nuclear administrations we've ever seen. Geothermal, build out the grid and do permitting reform. There's overlap between the things you want to be doing for a decarbonized agenda and also to meet the firm dispatchable power needs in the United States. And the idea that you could really dramatically shorten the time frame to new nuclear and bring nuclear capacity online faster, because now we have this national security and economic competitiveness imperative, as well as the imperative of trying to decarbonize the economy faster. That's a broader set of stakeholders, a broader set of motivations that actually could be quite powerful to bring a broader set of people together to try to move this agenda forward.
Maybe you mentioned speeding up the nuclear process. Like, I think Ricardo was kind of saying, well, it's going to still take a long time even if we get rid of these permits. But do you think it could actually be sped up even more? Like, what's your vision for that?
I think theoretically it can. It's incredibly hard, but we're doing a huge piece of work on that now at the Center on Global Energy Policy. What would a warp speed on nuclear power look like? What would it take to set a gigawatt goal, kind of a moonshot goal, or cut the time frame to new nuclear in half? How do you think about advanced nuclear technology and AP1000s and which make sense and which don't in that? But there's a whole set of actions using federal lands, improving the Nuclear Regulatory Commission permitting process, the NEPA review process, the mandatory hearing requirement, which maybe doesn't make sense in all cases. There's a whole set of steps that I think a government that really wanted to prioritize this could take to make it easier and faster to build new nuclear. And I'm optimistic, and we absolutely need that to meet growing energy demand, firm, dispatchable, 24/7, and we need it for the climate challenge as well.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting.